So it's really interesting because this is also ripped from the headlines, you know, free speech in the workplace. And I love that quote, Mark, that you just put up. Compliance training is not to change your mind, it's to keep your job. Everybody has opinions in the workplace. Everybody walks through that door with their own opinions on politics, on religion, you name it. You have your opinions. Is it appropriate to talk about them in the workplace? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit right now and some of the cases that have been happening. In particular, we're going to talk about like the NFL kneeling during the national anthem, because that has just been all over the news this fall. And you hear people say all the time, well, they have a First Amendment right to do this or that. And I think there's some misconceptions out there about what First Amendment actually protects and whether or not it protects somebody who's making political speech in the workplace. So, number one rule in Iowa, you hear it from us all the time, this is an at-will employment state. You can fire somebody at any time for any reason or for no reason, as long as you're not doing it for a discriminatory or harassing or retaliatory reason. So if you're violating something based on a protected class status, then you can't. But otherwise, it's pretty much any reason you want. So one of the issues with First Amendment speech is whether it happens in the workplace or outside the workplace. So, you know, it used to be on Friday night, you have workers that are talking, spouting off about whatever it might be, but it was down at the corner bar. Now it's on their Facebook page, or they've tweeted out something. You know, what do you do with that versus them saying it while they're working to their coworker who sits at the desk next to them and can't get away from it? So those are a couple of the issues. Social media has just inflated this issue incredibly. We get lots of calls all the time about an employee posted such and such on their Facebook page. Can I fire them for that? So let's talk through some of these. And I'm going to use a couple of recent cases out of the news as examples. So the Google case was really interesting, and that kind of kicked all this off a few months ago. One of the engineers at Google wrote this memo that he circulated internally, and basically he was critical of Google for going out and trying to increase diversity by trying to recruit women into the tech jobs at Google. And so he wrote this memo basically saying, there's a reason there are fewer women in tech jobs, and you can't overcome that just by trying to recruit and increase diversity. There are biological differences, biological reasons why they shouldn't be in tech jobs, including that they're higher agreeableness, they get along, more neuroticism, and that these are, biological reasons why they're ill-equipped to do the job. So this memo went public. It got out in the news, it went online, and the guy got fired, which created a whole backlash. And wait a minute, shouldn't he have a right to have his opinions? And a person shouldn't get fired just because they have opinions. Well, Google said it violated our code of conduct. For you to say that there's a whole class of our employees that are, incapable or biologically ill-equipped to do the job violates our code of conduct. An interesting note in this case is that the guy, before he got fired, filed a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board. I'm not sure exactly what the content of the complaint was, but after he was fired, then he tried to allege that it was retaliatory because he had filed this charge. The problem with that defense was that Google didn't even have notice of this NLRB charge at the time they fired him. It was strictly based on the discussion about this memo that he had circulated in the workplace. So, bottom line in this case is Google had a right to fire him. He wasn't engaging in any protected activity. He didn't have a First Amendment right to diss on a whole class of employees at Google and say they're all incapable of doing the job. And Google's code of conduct said you can't treat other employees with disrespect, and so they were within their rights to terminate his position. General rule, an employee's off the clock, private, political, or religious activities are protected. So, for example, if somebody posts something on their Facebook page, that they hate Trump or Hillary should be in jail or whatever it might be, generally speaking, that's not something you should worry about. We get lots of calls, like I said, about social media and things that people have posted on their social media and whether or not you can do anything about. Most of the time our advice is ignore it. It's not something that you should be addressing if it's not something that's coming into the workplace. They're entitled to spout off on whatever their political beliefs are. There's some caveats to that. So if they have on their Facebook page, that they're employed by you, or they have your company name, or somehow they're identifying with you on their social media, then you have a little bit more leeway to say you can't be putting that stuff out there because you're harming the company. But as opposed to in the bar on Friday night or on their social media accounts, it's when it happens in the workplace that you as an employer have more right to say, you can't be doing that. So just like the sex talk that Mark was talking about, you're not paying people to come in and have political talk. You're not paying them to come in and proselytize whatever their religious beliefs might be. They are there to do their job. So as they're on the clock for you, and they're engaging in this type of political or religious talk that's offending other people, that you have a right to discipline or even fire in those situations. So, and as always, you can censor speech that is discriminatory, harassing, or creates a hostile work environment. So, especially if someone for the first time this fall, I had a case involving two people that had to work together in close quarters in an office. And it was one that was repeatedly and continuously talking about Trump and the political aspects, and it made the other person really uncomfortable. And so it went on and on for months, and it ended up escalating into a workers' compensation claim for mental distress and all kinds of things. But in that situation, the employer has every right to say, look, no political speech. You're here to do your work. You can talk about work, and you need to keep that to a minimum. If it's creating a hostile work environment for the people around you, the employer has every right to say that needs to stop and take appropriate discipline to do so. So the takeaway from that, as in many cases, an employee's right to free speech generally ends where another person's rights begin. So yes, you have rights. You have rights to your opinions, you have a right to engage in political activity, etc. But when it infringes on other people's rights in the workplace and impedes their ability to do their work, I mean, you as an employer, that's obviously your number one concern, is that your people can be productive and comfortable in the workplace so that they can do a good job for you. The other thing, as I mentioned, is the NFL protests that we heard so much about in the last year. And Colin Kaepernick started it last year by kneeling during the national anthem. And so there have just been tons of, on social media and on the internet, discussions and articles about, well, shouldn't it be protected by free speech? They have a right to protest. The Constitution allows people to protest. But it's a little bit more of a narrow question, I think, on the NFL. And I think a lot of people, like I said, there are misconceptions out there about what the First Amendment actually protects. And so the question comes down to, can an employer force employees to stand during the national anthem or whatever, fill in the blank, whatever the activity may be. And it's not really a First Amendment issue. You're not protected for making political speech on the job. So if somebody wants to do a protest, it doesn't mean that they have a right to do it when they're on the clock for you. They're an employee, first and foremost. They're supposed to be doing their job. It's not the time for political speech or protests. So in the NFL case, it's interesting because it's not really a First Amendment issue at all. It's really a contractual issue for the NFL. And it comes down to whether or not there's anything in their contracts or their rule books or their manuals that govern their activity that requires them to do it. And if they violate that contract, the contractual obligation, then the employer has a right to terminate them. So for example, in the NFL case, if you look through the various contracts that govern the NFL players, you've got the NFL rule book, which applies to all the players and all the teams. It does not include any requirement to stand during the national anthem. You've got the NFL game operations manual, which I think governs like everything down to the most minute detail about how games are conducted and what the players are supposed to do. And that doesn't even have a requirement that the players have to stand during the anthem, but it does encourage it. So it may come down to individual team contracts and whether or not there's anything specifically in that specific player's contract with the owners of his team that requires him to do it. Okay, so absent a contractual obligation to do so, there's still the employer's right to terminate for political speech in the workplace. So as Trump suggested when he said, you know, you should just fire any SOB who doesn't stand during the anthem, teams may have the right to do that. I mean, the legal right may be there to do that. Whether or not they want to do it, there are, you know, obviously lots of other considerations that they have to take into account as they're addressing the issues. But legally, the First Amendment does not protect those NFL players who choose to kneel during the national anthem. And we've seen, it's interesting because we've seen various different responses from different team owners throughout this fall about how they've approached it. And it really comes down to whatever their particular interests are and their considerations are as far as whether or not they're going to force their players to stand or if they're going to kneel with their players. It really has nothing at all to do with the protection of free speech under the First Amendment. Okay, this is more recent. This just happened a couple weeks ago. Some of you may have seen the picture that was all over the internet of the woman who was biking in Virginia as Trump's motorcade left his golf course in rural Virginia. And as she's biking along, I didn't put the picture up. As she's biking along and the motorcade is going by, she obscene gesture, she flips off the motorcade repeatedly. So it's interesting because it was actually a White House photographer who was in one of the vehicles in the motorcade that took the picture. And it somehow got into like the White House photo pool and then got out and got on the internet and it just went viral. And so she saw it, found out about it later. And apparently she liked it because she made it her profile picture on Twitter and Facebook. And it was all over the internet and they were calling her a shero and you know, she really became, the face of protest, I guess, against the Trump administration. So, but once she saw that it went viral and late night talk show hosts were talking about it, et cetera, she went into her employer and said, okay, I have to tell you, that was me. I'm just being, full disclosure here. That's a picture of me. So a couple days later, they bring her in and they fire her and they say it violates our social media policy because you have it as your Facebook and Twitter profile pictures. And our policy, it prohibits any lewd or obscene materials on social media. So, fine, that's fair if she violated it. But it's interesting because her Facebook and Twitter did not identify the employer. It was not one where it said, so-and-so employee of, and identified her. And she was actually an employee of a government contractor, which explains why they took the action they did as far as terminating her, because they were concerned, obviously, it would affect their ability to get government contracts. But she wasn't on the job when it happened. Her Facebook and Twitter didn't identify the employer, but they still terminated her under their social media policy. The interesting thing about this, and it kind of remains to be seen what's going to happen if there's going to be some legal fallout, is that there was a male colleague of hers that had some information on his Facebook page, and his Facebook page did very clearly and prominently identify the employer. And I can't repeat it, but he had some things on his that he called someone an effing libtard, just a series of profanities on his Facebook page that identified the employer. And they brought him in, they told him to delete it, and he was allowed to keep his job. So she's kind of going, oh, wait, what I did was lewd and obscene, but what he did wasn't? So I think there may be, as with every policy, it has to be applied equally across the board. So it sounds like his criticism was of someone that he perceived to be liberal, and her criticism was of the president, and who's a Republican. So it may come down to whether or not they're applying their policy equally and indiscriminately across the board. So the bottom line is, one more. Yeah, we want to talk about the Charlottesville protests. They're a little bit older news now, but It was interesting to note that one of the folks that was marching with the white supremacists in Charlottesville, his picture and video got online. He actually worked for a hot dog chain in Berkeley, California. And when they saw that, he was fired by his employer there. Which, you know, again, the question is, this was something that happened outside of the workplace, but in an at-will state, if the employer thought it reflected badly upon them in some way, they had a legal right to terminate him. So one thing to keep in mind is that the right to terminate an employee doesn't necessarily mean that you get to deny them unemployment benefits. Some of you folks here in the room, I've worked with you before on unemployment claims, and unless it's some sort of willful misconduct, the employee may still be entitled to unemployment benefits even though you terminated them for something that violated your policies. And probably just violating your social media policy is not going to be considered willful misconduct, at least by our unemployment division here in Iowa. So bottom line is, First Amendment does not protect political speech in the workplace unless you may be a government employee, because there are specific rules for government employees. But otherwise, private employers, you have a right to take action if there is political, religious, or other speech within the workplace that is causing a disruption, that's making other employees uncomfortable, or that otherwise violates your policies.